Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation. Each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries. The sun had long since disappeared beyond the craggy peaks of the southern mountains, leaving behind a sickly orange glow that cast long shadows across the desolate village of Qingxi. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. It was late autumn, the season when the wind whispered like voices in the trees, carrying with it a chill that settled deep into the bones. For most villagers, it was a time to prepare for the coming cold, to gather wood and store food, but for one boy in the village, the darkness had already begun to close in. Wang Chang, a 12-year-old boy with hollow cheeks and a restless look in his eyes, wandered through the winding, narrow streets. His small hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his threadbare jacket, his breath misting in the cool night air. He had no destination, no place he needed to be. His feet dragged him along the familiar path towards the edge of the village, where the forest began, a place that had always filled him with both fear and fascination. The village of Qingxi was a place forgotten by time. The houses were old, wooden structures that leaned to one side, their paint peeling and weathered by years of neglect. The people, too, seemed to have been forgotten, locked in lives of hard work, poverty, and silence. The air was thick with a sense of resignation, as though the villagers had long ago accepted their fate. But Wang Chang was different. He was not like the other children of the village. His heart was a knot of restless energy, his mind darkened by the violence he witnessed every day in his home. His father, an alcoholic who had once been a proud man, had become a ghost of his former self, a hollow vessel of rage. Wang's mother, too, had long since lost her ability to care for her children. The love that should have filled their home had turned to dust, suffocated by years of fear and neglect. Wang's father was always there, in the corner of the room, silent but ever present, waiting to explode. Wang had learned early on how to anticipate the moments when the storm would come. He had learned to hold his breath, to shrink into the shadows when his father's fists flew, when his mother's sobs filled the air. He had learned to survive by becoming invisible. But survival, he realized now, was not enough. On this cold autumn evening, Wang found himself standing at the edge of the village, staring into the dense forest that stretched for miles. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, as though reaching for something just out of sight. The forest had always fascinated Wang, its endless darkness, place where secrets seemed to hide, waiting to be uncovered. It was a place where the quiet villagers dared not venture after dark, and where rumors of strange happenings and disappearances had been whispered for years. Wang was drawn to it, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to escape, to disappear into a place where no one would find him, where he could be free of the suffocating weight of his family's misery. He stepped closer to the trees, his feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of something, perhaps an animal, stirring in the darkness. Wang paused, his heart pounding in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, but he felt no fear. Instead, there was a strange sense of anticipation, a feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far greater than himself. As Wang moved deeper into the forest, the village and its troubles seemed to fade behind him. The trees closed in around him, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the weak light of the moon. The forest was dark, too dark to see clearly, but Wang did not need light. He knew this place. It was familiar, even though he had never been this far before. It was as though the trees themselves had begun to call to him, to beckon him into their depths. He walked for what felt like hours, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and underbrush. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fragments of memories, flashes of his father's violence, his mother's coldness, and the emptiness that had begun to take root inside him. One had always been different from the other children in the village. He had no friends, no one to share his thoughts with. He was alone, isolated, trapped in a world that had no place for him. The other kids had no idea what he went through at home, and he had no way of explaining it to them. They lived in a world of sunlight and laughter, while he existed in shadows, always watching, always waiting for the next blow to fall. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You're useless. You never amount to anything. You're just like me, weak, pathetic." Wang hated his father, but he hated himself even more for being afraid of him, for being trapped in a cycle of violence and fear that seemed impossible to break. The forest was growing darker with each passing step, the trees closing in around him like a cage. Wang felt a strange sense of unease settling in his chest. His breathing quickened, and for the first time that night, he wished he had turned back. But something deeper inside him pushed him forward, deeper into the unknown. As he walked, he stumbled upon a small clearing, the moonlight filtering through the trees to reveal a narrow, rocky path that led down towards a stream. The air here was colder, the scent of decay stronger. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something to happen. He knelt by the stream, his hands trembling as he dipped them into the cold water. The sensation sent a shiver through his body, but he welcomed it. It was a reminder that he was still alive, still feeling something, anything, other than the numbness that had begun to consume him. And then, he heard it. A sound that cut through the stillness of the night. A faint rustling in the bushes behind him, followed by a soft, shuffling noise. Wang froze, his heart racing. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he could see nothing. The forest was empty, silent once again. For a moment, Wang thought it was just the wind, playing tricks on his mind. But then the sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl. His pulse quickened. He stood up, his body tense, every muscle screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He couldn't move. His legs were frozen to the ground, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He could feel the weight of something terrible, lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. And then, from the darkness, it came. The village of Qingxi had long since fallen into the deep, silent grip of night. Only the chirping of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves punctuated the stillness. Most of the villagers were asleep, tucked away in their homes, wrapped in the fragile comfort of ignorance. But not Wang Chang. On this night, he could not sleep, for the storm within him raged far stronger than the one outside. It had been years since Wang had truly felt safe, years since he had been a child without the weight of fear pressing down on him every waking moment. He had always been angry. But now, the anger had grown like a twisted vine, wrapping itself around his thoughts, tightening until he felt as though it might burst from him, at any moment. His father's cruel words, his mother's indifference, they had fed the flame. But now, Wang no longer sought just to survive. He craved something more. He craved release. On that particular night, in 1995, Wang felt an almost magnetic pull towards the forest once again. There was no reason. No grand plan. It was simply the only place that gave him any sense of clarity. The village was stifling, a constant reminder of the suffocating life he led, one he could not escape. The village streets, once familiar and safe, had begun to feel like a prison. His father was passed out, drunk on the floor, his body sprawled carelessly across the cold, hard wood. His mother sat silently in the corner of the room, a thin, frail figure whose hollow eyes were staring into nothingness. Wang's sister had long since left the village, and his brothers were no longer in the picture. There was no one left but him and the endless cycle of cruelty that defined his home. Wang moved as quietly as possible, careful not to wake either of his parents. He stepped out into the crisp night air, letting the cool breeze carry away some of the burning tension in his chest. His breath fogged in front of him, and the darkness swallowed him whole. As he made his way through the narrow streets of Qingxi, his steps almost seemed to echo in the emptiness. The moon was hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds, casting the village into a thick blackness. He had no intention of going far, just far enough to be away from the suffocating air of his home. Wang's feet carried him instinctively toward the same forest. The one place where he could be alone, where the guilt and rage wouldn't follow him, where he could lose himself to the sound of his own thoughts. The same forest that had once comforted him, with its deep, unbroken silence, now called to him like an old friend, pulling him deeper into its secrets. The trees stood tall and foreboding. Their branches intertwined like ancient fingers, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. One had walked through this place countless times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the air was thicker, heavier. It seemed as though the forest was watching him, waiting. The chill in the air wrapped around him like a shroud, but it wasn't the cold that had him on edge. There was something else, something primal in the air, something he couldn't shake. It was then that he heard a rustle behind him. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. A sound, low, soft, but unmistakable, like footsteps on the forest floor. Wang's heart pounded in his chest. His first instinct was to run, to escape the darkness that seemed to press in on him from all sides, but he was rooted to the spot. Slowly, cautiously, he turned around. And there, just a few yards away, stood a girl. She was no older than Wang himself, perhaps 12 or 13. Her clothes were tattered, her hair disheveled. Her eyes, wide and terrified, stared directly at him. She had no reason to be here in the middle of the night, none at all. She looked lost, and she looked scared. Wang's body tensed. He hadn't expected anyone to be out here. The forest was his place, his refuge, his escape from everything. He had no business with this girl, no reason to care about her. But her presence here, in the same place where he sought solace, felt like an intrusion. The girl took a step towards him, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't hurt me." Wang said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. Something about the moment felt off, as if the air around them had thickened with something sinister. He watched the girl with cold, calculating eyes. She didn't belong here. She had no place in his world. He had been angry for so long, angry at the world, at the people who had hurt him. Now, In this dark place, in the shadow of his own growing rage, the opportunity to release that anger was within his grasp. He took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The girl's eyes widened, and her breath quickened as she stepped back, stumbling over a root and falling to the ground. Wang didn't feel a pang of guilt. He didn't feel fear. He simply felt the urge, the overwhelming need to make the world pay for the years of torment he had endured. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, yanking her to her feet. The girl gasped, her body shaking with fear, her face pale in the moonless night. She tried to scream, but her voice was weak, barely a tremor in the air. Her hands beat helplessly against his chest, but Wang could feel no sympathy. All he felt was the rush of something dark and heavy inside him. The girl's terror fueled him. She was weak. She was powerless. She had no way of stopping him. She was just like everyone else. Just another person who would never understand the pain he had lived through. He shoved her into the brush, his breath ragged. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing in, as though the very earth was conspiring against the two of them. Wang didn't care. He didn't need to think about it anymore. He just needed to feel the release. Her eyes, wide, pleading, filled with desperation, told him everything he needed to know. She was terrified. But she would never see him coming. She would never know what hit her. Wang awoke in his small, dimly lit room, his body tangled in a thin, worn blanket. His mind felt heavy, as though it was drowning in a thick fog that clung to his thoughts. He blinked several times, trying to push away the nightmarish images that danced behind his eyelids, flashes of pale skin, white, pleading eyes, the faint, singing sound of a choking breath, the feeling of power coursing through his veins. For a brief moment, it all felt like a dream, like something that wasn't real. But the smell of earth, damp and cold, still lingered in his nostrils. The pain in his knuckles, raw and aching, reminded him that it had been no dream. He could still feel the weight of the girl's fragile body in his grip, the terror that had radiated from her. Wang turned his head to the side, his eyes falling on the cracked, yellowed wall of the room. His father's snoring filled the air, a low, guttural sound that seemed to blend with the deep silence of the house. Wang's father lay sprawled on the floor, as he often did after another night of drinking, his body motionless, except for the rise and fall of his chest. Wang stared at him for a moment, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. How long had it been since he had felt any sense of connection to the man who had once been his father? The man who had once terrified him with his drunken rages, the man who had once called him worthless. His hand ached to strike him, to make him feel the way Wang had felt all those years. But he did nothing. He simply lay still, staring into the dim light. It wasn't the violence that was eating him alive, it was the guilt. The guilt that had settled in his gut like a black stone, weighing him down. The guilt that told him he had become no better than the man he despised. He had taken that girl's life, taken it without thought, without remorse. He had felt the rush of power in that moment, and now it gnawed at him, from the inside out. But that feeling, it had been intoxicating. It wasn't until later that morning, when Wang ventured into the woods again, that he began to question himself more deeply. He had walked there, his feet moving almost mechanically, the weight of the previous night pressing heavily on his chest. The memories of the girl's pale face, the feel of her hands in his, seemed to replay in his mind over and over again. He had tried to block it out, to tell himself that it didn't matter, that he had done what was necessary. But it was impossible to ignore. The forest seemed more oppressive today, the trees closing in on him, their branches clawing at the air as if trying to pull him back into the darkness. The familiar scent of damp leaves and decaying wood was thick in the air. Every rustle, every creak of the branches felt like a warning. His feet sunk into the soft soil, the mud squelching beneath his weight, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The forest had always been his sanctuary, the only place where he could forget his pain, his father's cruelty, his mother's indifference. And now it felt like his prison. He reached the small clearing where he had killed the girl, the place where he had felt both terror and release. The memory of that night was burned into his mind, vivid and unsettling. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the image of her body lying motionless in the underbrush. Her wide, staring eyes, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. He could still hear the faint rasp of her breath, the tremor in her voice as she begged him to stop. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as he opened his eyes again. The clearing seemed different now. The air was thick with something dark and oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more suffocating. Wang swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat, but he pushed it down. He couldn't think about it. He couldn't afford to. The following days passed in a haze of guilt and dread. Wang tried to go about his routine, going to the village market, helping his father with the odd jobs around the house. But it felt like he was moving through a dream. Everything around him seemed unreal, as if the world had shifted into a new, more terrifying place. People in the village started to notice his strange behavior. He couldn't look them in the eye anymore, couldn't meet their gazes without feeling as though they knew. They would glance at him with suspicion, murmuring under their breath. Wang's father barely acknowledged his existence anymore, but Wang could feel the shift in the air between them. His father's eyes, even when they were glassy and drunk, seemed to watch him closely, as though something was wrong. One afternoon, Wang was walking through the market, his head bowed, lost in his own dark thoughts, when he heard the familiar voice of the town's butcher. "Wang Chang," the man called out, his voice rough and deep. "You seem a little off lately. Everything alright at home?" Wang stiffened, his throat closing up. He didn't want to answer, didn't want anyone to know how he felt, how terrified he was that they could somehow see what he had become. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were beginning to catch up with him. He was drowning in his own guilt, and every face in the village seemed like an accusation. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice low and distant, and quickly turned away. But the butcher's gaze followed him, a knowing look in his eyes. Wang's pulse quickened. That night, he lay in bed, the weight of the day's encounter sitting heavily on his chest. Every creak of the house, every breath of the wind outside, seemed to echo in his ears. He tried to sleep, but the fear wouldn't leave him. It crawled under his skin, making his skin itch. The girl's face, those wide, terrified eyes, kept returning to his mind, taunting him with her memory. He couldn't shake it. He tried to forget her, tried to convince himself that what he had done was nothing, that she had been just another victim in a world full of suffering. But the truth was, he didn't know what he had become. Wang was changing. And not for the better. Days turned into weeks, and Wang's sense of unease deepened. It was no longer just the guilt that plagued him. It was the need, the hunger. A dark, gnawing craving that grew stronger with each passing day. It whispered to him, urging him to do it again. The quiet moments, when he could have been at peace, were now filled with thoughts of violence. He couldn't push the darkness away, no matter how hard he tried. He was terrified of what he had become. But at the same time, a part of him felt exhilarated by the power he had felt when he had taken that girl's life. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, if only for a moment. But it wasn't enough. The first kill had unleashed something inside him, a monster he couldn't control. And it was hungry. One cold evening, as Wang walked through the narrow streets of Qingxi, he spotted a girl about the same age as the one he had killed. She was standing by the riverbank, staring into the water, her long hair blowing in the wind. She seemed lost, disconnected from the world around her. Wang's heart raced. He knew what he wanted. He knew what was coming. Wang Chong's hands shook as he lay in bed that night. The small room was suffocating, the air heavy with the scent of stale alcohol and the ever-present odor of sweat. The familiar stench of his father's foul breath lingered even though he had long since passed out, sprawled on the floor. Wang was used to it by now. The sounds of his father's grunts and snoring had become a constant part of his life, like a background noise that never went away. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, Wang felt the tension rising inside him, gnawing at his chest, tightening around his heart like a vice. It had been weeks since he had committed his first murder. Weeks since he had felt that sick, euphoric rush that had flooded his veins after taking the girl's life. And now, the craving was back, darker, more insatiable than before. His mind was a battlefield. One part of him knew that what he had done was wrong. The guilt had come in waves, harrowing, suffocating waves that had consumed him since that night in the forest. But another part of him, the darker part, had begun to crave that feeling again. The power. The release. The control over life and death. The way he could make someone feel so small, so utterly powerless, and know that he had taken their life, that he had decided their fate. It had consumed him. Wang closed his eyes and tried to push the thoughts away, but they were relentless, like 1,000 whispers in the dark. He could still see the girl's face, pale and terrified, her wide eyes filled with fear as she pleaded for her life. The memory replayed in his mind over and over again. He could still hear her voice in his ears, her trembling whispers, her desperate cries. But he didn't care anymore. He was no longer the same person he had been before that night. Something had changed inside him. A darkness had settled deep in his soul, and it was pulling him closer to the edge. He couldn't fight it. He didn't want to fight it anymore. It had been a few days since the first murder, and Wang had spent the time keeping to himself, avoiding the village and the prying eyes of the people. He couldn't look anyone in the face. He couldn't even look in the mirror without seeing the darkness that had taken hold of him. But the feeling, the craving, was only growing stronger. Every day, he became more consumed by it. He felt the urge building inside him like a pressure, waiting to explode. And then, one afternoon, as he wandered the outskirts of the village, he saw her. A young girl, no more than 15, standing by the riverbank, her back to him. She was staring into the water, her long black hair flowing in the wind. She didn't see him at first, but Wang did not need to see her face. He could already feel the pull, the need. His body moved before he could stop it, his feet carrying him toward her like a predator drawn to its prey. The girl was alone, a rare thing in a village where people rarely ventured far from their homes. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The silence was almost suffocating. Wang's heart pounded in his chest as he approached her from behind, his hands trembling with anticipation. For a moment, he hesitated. The guilt rose up in his throat, choking him. What was he doing? What had become of him? But before he could think too much about it, the darkness that had consumed him before took over. His instincts kicked in. He could feel the pull, the power of control, the rush of dominance, and the cold thrill that washed over him like ice water. He stepped closer. The girl turned around suddenly, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw him standing there, just a few feet away. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the riverbank for balance. Her expression was confused at first, but quickly shifted to fear. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her body was stiff, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. But Wang knew there would be no escape for her. He said nothing. His hand reached out, grabbing her wrist before she could react. Her startled cry was cut short by his iron grip. She tried to pull away, but her strength was no match for his. She stumbled, her eyes wide with terror, her face pale under the fading light of the afternoon. Her breath came in short gasps, and her chest heaved with fear. "Let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper now. "Please." Wang's eyes were cold, distant. He said nothing. He simply dragged her deeper into the trees, away from the river, into the darkness. They reached a small clearing, the same one where he had killed the first girl. It was as though he had been drawn there, by some unseen force, by the pull of his own twisted desires. The forest was eerily quiet, the shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower in the sky. The girl's frantic cries echoed in the air, but no one was around to hear them. No one but him. Wang pushed her to the ground, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with anticipation. He watched as she scrambled to her feet, her wide eyes searching for a way to escape. But there was no escape. Not here. "Please, don't," she begged, her voice breaking. "I'll give you anything. Just let me go." But Wang had no use for her pleas. He could hear her desperation, but it did nothing to sway him. He was beyond caring about her words, about her life. He only cared about the control, the release, the power that came with ending it all. His hands closed around her neck, the weight of his anger, his pain, his hatred pressing down on him like a physical force. He could feel the strength draining from her body as she fought, her hands clawing at his arms, trying to pull him away. But Wang was stronger. The anger, the rage, the madness, it gave him strength. And then, finally, she stopped moving. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his as the life drained from her body. Her lips parted in a silent scream, but no sound came. Wang held her until she was completely still, until her body grew limp in his arms. And then, it was over. Wang stood there, staring down at the girl's lifeless body, his chest heaving with the exertion of what he had just done. His body trembled, but there was no guilt, no shame. Only a hollow emptiness. It wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. The next few days passed in a blur. Wang went about his life as if nothing had happened. The village was too small, too insular, for anyone to notice the absence of the girl. His father, drunk and unaware, didn't even ask where she had gone. Wang's guilt was gone, replaced by the cold emptiness that had taken root in his heart. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep living this life, this twisted, violent existence. The darkness inside him was only growing stronger with each passing day. It was feeding off his guilt, his anger, his pain. And it would never let him go. The urge to kill was now an insatiable hunger. He couldn't control it anymore. Every day, it gnawed at him, eating away at what little humanity he had left. He needed it, needed the release, the rush, the power. But the madness was starting to take its toll. Wang's mind became fractured. He started to see things, shadows moving in the corners of his vision, faces in the darkness. He heard whispers, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. They taunted him, mocked him for the monster he had become. He was no longer sure if they were real or if they were just fragments of his broken mind. It didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the darkness that consumed him, the hunger that could never be satisfied. Wang Chang had always been able to slip into the shadows, to blend with the dirt and the trees, to move silently through the cracks of his small, decaying world. But now, for the first time in years, he felt eyes on him. It was as if something was following him, something that wasn't his father's drunken rage or the fleeting suspicion in the eyes of the villagers. No, this was something else. It had been months since Wang had begun to kill, and though he had told himself that it was nothing more than an urge, a fleeting dark thought he could control, he had been lying to himself. The truth was, every murder deepened his need, every life he took fed the hunger within him. He could feel it now, gnawing at his insides, an insatiable craving. It was not enough. The emptiness it created was always there, waiting to be filled, but nothing could fill it. He was becoming more restless, more paranoid. His thoughts were disjointed, like shards of glass scraping against the inside of his skull. Even when he wasn't out in the forest, his mind was there. It was with the bodies he'd left behind. The faces. The blood. The silence. And now, there were whispers. One couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It started as a distant sensation, something that crept up on him when he was alone. At first, it was only the occasional glance he caught from the corners of his eye, a shadow moving too quickly, the flicker of a distant light in the trees. But soon, the feeling became impossible to ignore. One night, after returning from another routine trip into the woods, Wang was startled to find that his door was slightly ajar. He hadn't left it open. It was a simple lock, nothing special, but it was always secure. The wind hadn't been blowing. And yet, there it was, his door, creaking inwards, as though someone had just been there. His heart began to race. Wang stepped inside cautiously, his breath shallow, eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The smell of old alcohol and the sour scent of his father's sweat still lingered in the air. But there was something else now, something thicker. The stench of fear. He stepped forward, careful to make as little noise as possible. His father's snoring was louder than usual, his body spread out on the floor in the same way it had been for years. But Wang felt the weight of silence pressing in on him like a physical thing. He glanced toward the small window, the same one he'd used to watch for intruders when he was a child. It was dark outside, the moon barely visible through the trees. And that's when he saw it, a figure moving in the trees. Just outside the window, there was a shadow, larger than any animal. It moved with purpose, the way a person would move. Wang's pulse quickened. He froze, his eyes narrowing. Was someone watching him? Or was it his mind, playing tricks on him, making him paranoid, making him feel like he was being hunted, when he was the one doing the hunting? The following days became a blur of unease and confusion. Wang avoided the village, choosing instead to remain in the house, staring at the walls, waiting for something, anything, to change. His thoughts spiraled. He couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. His father's drunken rants became nothing more than a background hum. He no longer noticed the people who passed by his house, or the faint whisper of the wind in the trees. All he could hear was the drumming of his own heart in his ears. His father's face began to haunt him. He was no longer the man who had once beaten him, the man who had twisted his sense of worth. No, now his father had become a symbol of everything one despised, everything that had pushed him down this dark path. His drunken voice was always there, whispering, taunting, accusing him of being just as monstrous as he had once been. One evening, after yet another restless night of pacing through his house, one went for a walk. He needed to clear his head, to find something to take his mind off the endless cycle of violence that was consuming him. The village was quiet as usual, the streets deserted. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees. Wang's footsteps echoed down the empty road as he made his way to the market square, the place where he had met the butcher weeks ago. He knew that people in the village were starting to take notice of him. He was an outsider now, a strange presence, who never looked people in the eye and who always seemed lost in his own world. As he approached the square, his eyes caught sight of something he hadn't expected, a small crowd gathered around the butcher's stand. A group of people stood, whispering in low voices, their eyes flicking nervously toward Wang as he passed. For the first time, he noticed that the atmosphere had changed. There was an air of suspicion that hung thick in the air, eyes following his every move, whispers growing louder, glances exchanged when he wasn't looking. It was as if they knew. One had become used to the paranoia, the feeling of always being on edge. But it wasn't until later that night that things began to truly unravel. He had returned to his house after the walk, feeling the familiar weight of the darkness settling in around him. The room was still as cold as it had been when he left. His father had long since passed out on the floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. The place was empty, except for Wang. He was alone. But then came a knock at the door. The sudden sound ripped through the quiet like a thunderclap. Wang froze, his heart lurching in his chest. He had not expected anyone. His mind raced, wondering who could be outside at this time of night. He moved slowly, cautiously, until he stood at the door. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the air pressing against him. And then, without thinking, he opened the door. Standing on the other side was a man, a stranger with a weathered face, wearing dark clothes. The man was older, his eyes sharp and calculating. His expression was serious, though there was a faint flicker of recognition when he saw Wang standing in the doorway. "Wang Chang?" the man asked in a deep, rumbling voice. His tone was calm, but there was an undertone of something else, something that made Wang's stomach churn with unease. Wang said nothing, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "I'm with the local police," the man continued. "We've been looking for you." Wang's heart nearly stopped at the words. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice harsh. He suddenly felt the suffocating weight of his secrets pressing down on him, the guilt, the fear, the darkness. His pulse pounded in his ears, his mind reeling. The man seemed to notice the shift in Wang's demeanor. His eyes narrowed. "We have questions," the man said, taking a step closer. "There's been a string of disappearances in the area, and we need to talk to you about them." Wang's mind raced. Disappearances? Had they linked him to them already? His stomach twisted in knots as his gaze darted to the trees outside, to the edge of the forest, where the bodies lay hidden beneath the earth. The pressure was too much. I don't know what you're talking about, Wang said, his voice cracking slightly, though he tried to remain calm. I haven't seen anyone disappear. The man stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slightly, as if making up his mind about something. Maybe I should take a look around, the officer said softly, as if the words were nothing more than a casual suggestion. Wang's body tensed. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of panic clawing at his throat. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on him. Wang's hands were shaking uncontrollably. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. He knew that this was the moment where everything he had worked to keep hidden would unravel. If the officer found something, anything, his life would be over. One had only one choice. His mind raced as he glanced towards the knife block on the counter, the same knife he had used countless times. It sat there, gleaming in the dim light of the room, as though it were calling to him. Without thinking, his hand moved. What followed was a blur of movement, fear, and darkness. The officer never had a chance to react. Wang struck with brutal efficiency, desperation making his hands faster, stronger, as though his life depended on it. When it was over, Wang was alone again, his hands slick with blood, his body trembling uncontrollably. The door to his past had been opened, and there was no way back. The once silent house now echoed with the hollow sound of Wang Chong's breathing. The blood on his hands, still fresh and vivid, seemed to stain every corner of his dimly lit room, creeping into the walls, the floor, the very air. His father lay motionless, a pitiful heap of flesh in the corner, but Wang could not bring himself to look at him. The man's face was twisted, in a grimace of terror, a reflection of everything Wang had ever felt. His father had always been the monster of Wang's nightmares, yet now, he too was merely a victim, lost in the same cycle of violence that Wang had become a prisoner to. He felt it, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him, a force far more suffocating than anything he had ever known. He had killed. He had slaughtered. And in that moment, all the years of pain, all the moments of brokenness and rage, finally caught up to him. The house was eerily quiet, save for the quiet drip of blood falling from Wang's fingers onto the floor. He wiped his hands on his clothes, but no matter how much he tried to clean himself, the stains remained. They clung to him like a second skin, inescapable and unyielding. Wang stumbled to the window and looked out at the dark, cold night. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, the forest whispering secrets to the wind. The very air felt heavy, charged with a presence that Wang could not fully comprehend. He was surrounded by darkness, yet it felt as though the darkness was inside him now. It was a part of him. He had run from it for years, but now, there was nowhere left to hide. The knocking started just after midnight. It was soft at first, an insistent, rhythmic tapping on the door. Wang could hear it from across the room, and it sent a shiver down his spine. His heart pounded as he stared at the door, unable to move, unable to speak. The knocking grew louder, more persistent, until it was a steady pounding, relentless, almost mocking. Wang Chong, a voice called out through the wood. He recognized it immediately. The voice of the police officer. The one who had been at his door only days before, the one who had questioned him. The officer had been following the trail, the string of disappearances, the strange happenings around the village. Wang had feared this day would come, and now, it had. Wang stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room. There was nowhere to run. The house felt like a trap, its walls closing in on him, and outside, the dark forest waited. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as the knocking continued, louder and louder, until the door seemed to shudder under the weight of it. Wang Chang. Open up, the officer shouted. Wang looked around, his eyes wild. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts as he realized there was no escape. The officer wasn't alone anymore. A second voice, another man, stern and cold, joined in the chorus. His mind raced, but all his thoughts kept circling back to one truth: there was no way out. His gaze fell on the knife, still glinting in the dim light, the weapon he had used to end the officer's life earlier. His hand twitched as he reached for it, his fingers closing around the cold, steel handle. It felt familiar, comforting even. But this time, the knife was not for survival. It was for his own end. Wang knew that if he stayed, he would be captured. He would be sentenced to die, his story would be told, and the lives he had stolen would not be forgotten. There was no justice in that, no redemption. There was only the slow, inevitable march of death. Yet if he ran, the darkness would follow him. It always had. And so, in that moment, the weight of his choices finally came crashing down. He dropped the knife on the floor with a loud clatter, his shoulders sagging in defeat. His mind was numb, but deep down, he knew that this was the only way out. The door cracked open, and the officer's eyes widened as he stepped inside. He glanced at Wang, standing in the center of the room, his hands still stained with blood, his face hollow with guilt and despair. Wang's eyes met the officer's. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his actions. All the violence, the pain, the rage, everything he had tried to hide, was laid bare. There was no longer a place for him to run, no more shadows to hide in. The darkness had caught up with him, and it would claim him just as it had claimed every other life he had taken. Wang took a deep breath, his body trembling, as the officer raised his hand. The room grew still, the silence suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Then came the final sound, the single, hollow crack of a gunshot. Wang Chang's body crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The life that had once been so full of rage and pain had come to a quiet, tragic end. And outside, the forest remained still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened at all. The darkness had won.